High on a mountainside in Asia Minor, under a sky brimming with stars, a young man lies asleep in the open air, and has been asleep, the old stories insist, for longer than any mortal life should ever last. Motionless and silent, he does not stir, and if he ever dreams, no one has lived long enough to hear him tell it. Grass grows up around him. Seasons turn and turn again, and still he does not wake. Each night, when the sky finally goes dark enough, a pale light drifts down from above and settles beside him. Not starlight, not torchlight, but the goddess of the moon herself, descending from her long crossing of the heavens to sit with a man who can never once open his eyes to greet her. Why would a goddess who could love anyone choose to love someone who can never answer her? And why would a mortal, offered almost anything at all, choose an eternity of sleep over an ordinary life that simply ends, the way every other life does? Those questions sit at the center of the strange, hushed story waiting for you tonight. The tale of Endymion, the shepherd or king, so beautiful that the moon herself came down for him, and the sleep that neither the passing centuries nor the gods themselves have ever broken. If you enjoy these stories, take a moment to subscribe. It truly helps this channel, and tell me in the comments which myth you'd like next. Now, let the mountain go quiet, and let the moon rise over Endymion. The old sources cannot even agree on exactly who Endymion was before the moon first noticed him, and that disagreement is itself part of the myth's strange character. Some storytellers called him a king, ruling the region of Elis in the western Peloponnese, a descendant of Zeus through his father Athleus, blessed with more beauty than any mortal ruler had a right to possess. Others placed him far to the east instead, on the slopes of Mount Latmus in Caria, and made him nothing grander than a shepherd or a hunter, a young man who spent his nights beneath the open sky watching over a scattered flock or waiting out the dark between one hunt and the next. Whichever version a listener preferred, one detail never changed from telling to telling. Endymion's beauty was said to be almost unbearable to look at directly, the kind of beauty poets usually reserve for gods rather than men. Young forever it seemed, he carried a stillness in his face that made people fall quiet around him without quite knowing why. Whether he ruled a kingdom by day or simply minded sheep, the stories agree that he spent long hours alone beneath the stars, far from cities and courts and the noise of other people, in the kind of silence where a person can hear their own heartbeat and very little else. It was in exactly that silence, on the slopes of Mount Latmus, beneath the sky already crowded with more stars than any city dweller ever saw, that something far above him first turned to look down. Long before Endymion ever closed his eyes on Mount Latmus, Selene had already been crossing the heavens every single night for longer than memory could reach. A Titan's daughter, sister to the sun god Helios and to Eos, the rose-fingered goddess of dawn, she was tasked with driving the moon in its slow silver chariot across the dark, drawn by a pair of pale horses or by white oxen, depending on which poet happened to be singing the tale that night. Night after night, she made the same lonely crossing, watching over a sleeping world that never once looked back up at her. The Greeks pictured her as a serene, luminous figure, crowned with a narrow crescent, her light gentler and cooler than her brother's blazing sun, falling evenly over sleeping cities and silent mountains and empty seas alike, touching everything and holding nothing. By its very nature, it was a solitary duty. The sun had the whole daylight world to warm and wake and set into motion. The moon simply washed over what was already asleep, hour after hour, with no one to keep her company but the stars scattered thinly around her chariot. Perhaps that is why, of all the countless figures moving beneath her light, it was finally a sleeping man who caught her attention. Not a hero in the middle of some loud, waking triumph, but someone as still and quiet as the very hours she moved through, night after changeless night. One night, gliding above the ridges of Caria on her usual course, Selene looked down and saw a young man lying in a mountain hollow, asleep beneath the open sky, his face turned upward as though waiting for her light to find it. The old poets say she stopped her chariot, or slowed it, at least. However, a goddess slows something that has never once paused before in all the ages of its crossing, and looked longer than a goddess passing overhead has any real reason to look. Whether he had lain down to rest after tending his flock, or after a long day's hunting on the slopes, hardly mattered to her at that moment. What she saw instead was a stillness that matched her own, a face untroubled by ambition or fear or hunger, lit silver by her own descending light, utterly at peace in a way no waking person she had ever passed over seemed to be. Quietly she came down to him, not as a blaze of overwhelming glory, the way a god might announce themselves to a mortal, but softly, the way moonlight settles over a hillside without anyone quite noticing the exact moment it arrives. Long minutes passed while she simply watched him sleep, learning the shape of his face by heart. By the time she rose back into the sky to finish her crossing, something in her nightly journey had changed forever. She now had somewhere to return to, someone to look for in the dark, long before her light ever reached him again. What happened next depends entirely on which ancient storyteller is doing the telling, and the differences between their versions say almost as much about this myth as the story itself. In one telling, it was Endymion who set the terms of his own fate. Zeus, moved by the young man's extraordinary beauty, or perhaps by Selene's evident devotion to him, offered Endymion a single wish, any gift at all, without condition or limit. Given the chance to ask for anything in the world, Endymion did not ask for a kingdom, or glory, or simple long life. He asked for eternal youth, a face and body that time could never touch, and for the rare privilege of choosing how and when he would eventually die. According to those who told the story this way, Endymion weighed the terms of his own mortality with a clarity most people are never given the chance to use, and in the end he chose sleep over dying outright. An unending rest instead of a final ending, a way of stopping the clock without ever quite stepping off it. In a second telling, the choice belonged to Selene, not to him. Watching her beloved grow older with every season while she herself remained forever young and unchanging, a goddess entirely untouched by time, Selene could not bear the thought of one day losing him. So she went to Zeus herself and pleaded on his behalf, begging that Endymion be preserved exactly as he was, unaging, unchanging, frozen at the precise moment of his youth and beauty, so that she might go on loving him without ever losing him to age or sickness or death. Zeus granted her request, but the price of that eternal, unchanging beauty was the same in either telling. Endymion would sleep without ever waking again forever. From that point on, Endymion never opened his eyes again. Laid, or perhaps simply left, in a hollow cave on the slopes of Mount Latmus, he was sheltered from rain and sun alike, his body untouched by age or illness, or the ordinary decay that comes eventually for every other sleeping thing. The years passed over him, the way water passes over a stone in a riverbed, present, moving, changing everything else in its path, and yet leaving him exactly as he had always been. Shepherds who later grazed their flocks on those same slopes were said to point out the cave to travelers passing through, lowering their voices as they did, as though a sleep that old deserved a kind of quiet reverence most living things never earn. No hunger touched him, and no wound ever found him. Nothing that anyone could see seemed to trouble him at all. No mark, no sign, no evidence that time was passing over his still breathing body the way it passed over everything else on that mountain. Imagine a strange kind of eternity built entirely out of stillness, not a hero's triumph frozen at its peak, not a martyr's suffering held forever in cold stone, but simply a young man asleep, hour after hour, century after century, on a quiet mountainside where the wind moved endlessly through the grass and the stars wheeled overhead, and nothing about him ever changed at all. Every night that followed, when her long crossing of the sky finally brought her near enough, Selene came down to him. She never announced herself, never tried to wake him, never seemed to want to. She simply arrived, her pale light falling over the mouth of the cave and across his still face, and stayed as long as her duties in the heavens allowed her to stay. What passed between them during those long hours belongs more to poetry than to any ordinary kind of storytelling. Endymion could not speak to her. could not reach for her, could not so much as open his eyes to confirm that she had come at all that night. And yet the old poets insisted again and again across centuries of retelling that this was a genuine love story, one of the strangest and most devoted in all of Greek myth, precisely because it survived entirely without conversation, without touch, without any of the ordinary evidence that two people care for each other. A silence was what she loved, a shape in the dark that never changed, never disappointed her, never grew tired of her company or impatient with her long daytime absences the way a waking lover eventually might. Whether that made her love purer than any other goddesses or simply lonelier than any of the others is a question the ancient storytellers never quite tried to answer. They seemed content, instead, to leave her there, night after night, watching over a man who could never once watch her back. Strange as it sounds, the old sources add one more detail to this story of a love built almost entirely on silence. They say that Selene and Endymion had daughters together, 50 of them in all, known as the Menae. To the Greeks, who watched the moon's changing phases as carefully as they watched almost anything else in the sky, that particular number was not an accident. 50 months made up the span of a single Olympiad, the 4-year cycle by which the Greeks counted the time between their great athletic festivals, and the moon's changing face marked out each of those months in turn, one slow phase at a time. The 50 daughters of Selene and Endymion were, in a sense, the months themselves given the shape of a story. Proof, if a listener wanted proof, that something real and lasting had grown out of those quiet nightly visits on the mountainside, whatever the exact nature of a love between a wakeful goddess and a man who never once opened his eyes. There is something strange and almost mathematical in that kind of tenderness, folding the passage of time itself into the myth of two lovers who existed on entirely different sides of it. She forever moving forward through her nights and duties, he forever still, and somehow, in the telling, the two of them met often enough in the spaces between to fill 50 months with daughters. There is something unusually tender and unusually sad buried inside the story of Endymion, and it has little to do with the loud triumphs and disasters that fill most Greek myths. No city burns in this story. No monster is slain. A young man simply falls asleep, and a goddess simply keeps loving him anyway, and neither of those two facts ever really changes again for as long as the story is told. Read one way, it is a story about the terrible price of stopping time, about everything that is lost, even in a love that never argues and never ends, when one half of it can no longer wake up to take part in it. Read another way, it is a story about a devotion so complete that it did not need consciousness to survive at all, a goddess content to love a stillness rather than lose a person entirely to death, the way every other mortal she might have loved instead would eventually have been lost to her. Both readings were probably true at different moments to the people who first told this story beside their own fires, under their own version of Selene's light. In the end, perhaps it is simply a myth about moonlight falling on someone who cannot feel it landing, and about a love patient enough to keep returning anyway, every single night, for as long as the moon still rises over the world. If this is the kind of story you want more of, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments which myth I should tell next. Sleep well.